Welcome, AP World History. Once again, my name is Jason Epan. This is class number 10. Today, we're going to continue our journey through the period of the Roman Empire. And then we'll also talk about some of its, a lot of the qualities of the Roman Empire, etc., etc. But for right now, let's take a step back before we take a step forward, and let's talk about these questions I asked you at the end of class number 9. First of all, compare and contrast Sparta and Athens. Sparta is the military machine, lean, mean. It's not about social distinction, egalitarian, women, some of the same rights as men, same amount of physical education, very ascetic, simple life, a little bit dull and old-fashioned, but very steady. Athens, dynamic, maritime trade, they're huge traders, their economy is huge, lots of wealth to be made by certain groups of people. Outside of that, a lot of inequity, lots of slaves in Athens. Athens, obviously, of course, known for its tremendous culture, both from philosophy and theater and drama, etc., etc., and books, not as much as Sparta. Athens, also, you would say Athens' personality and maybe a love of itself and what it potentially could be ends up leading to its ruin as well, as they break up relations between the city-states via the Delian League, leading to the Peloponnesian War and Sparta's conquest of Athens. What was the legacy of the Empire of Alexander? Alexander was from Macedon. Macedon were Greek speakers. Hellenistic empires is what became of Alexander's empire when he died. Hellenes refers to the Greek-speaking world. So what you have is the exportation of Greek language and Greek culture everywhere, from Western Europe all the way to India. And that basically is, you know, the Greek and the Greek way of life and the Greeks, everything I just mentioned, language and culture, all remains part of the Hellenistic empires during this particular time. Also, you know, you could say a lot of the old sort of ancient pre-classical empires are very much gone due to Alexander's bum rush in. Okay, and even some of the early classical periods, like the Mauryan dynasty, all of these things have completely ended or been destroyed, cut off because of Alexander's dominance in their land during this time. Bye-bye Persian Empire. Remember Persian Empire, the Achaemenids were at their, you know, they had already seen their glory, but Alexander put their empire out of existence. So you could talk about that as well. Trace the development of Greek philosophical thought from Socrates through Hellenistic. We talked about this a lot last class. Everything from Socrates, the dialogues he had, the difference between Plato's Platonic idealism, which is, people think it's a bit of realism, compared to the sophists who believe in just experience only. Aristotle, his ideas of logic, his faulty reasoning on geocentrism. And then through Hellenistic times, you got the Epicureans, the skeptics, and the Stoics. A lot of stuff you can do right there. You're going to want to talk about the influence of Aristotle in terms of logic and rational thought, especially to Christian and Islamic philosophers, which we will talk about later, etc., etc. And that basically charts the thing. Plato writing down everything that Socrates had, his dialogues, Plato's Republic, his World of Forms, etc., etc. Okay? Anyways, and those are just the things you want to cover if you do get some type of free response question like that. However, even this stuff that I'm asking right now, it's not meant to be like a free response question. It's mostly from memory, so that our brains, or your brain, which should be even stronger than my brain, you know all the material and you feel confident about it. Okay, anyways, let's move on. We ended last class talking about the growth of the empire, and the empire is expanding, whereas we also discussed the sort of construct of the Roman Republican government and how it relates to a variety of people, be it the aristocracy, the patricians, or the commoners, a much larger class of people, the plebeians. In the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Rome is really consolidating its position in the Mediterranean, so that in a couple centuries later, its main competitor is this city-state called Carthage, C-A-R-T-H-A-G-E. The Carthaginians, if that's the correct pronunciation, are from Phoenician descent. And Phoenicia was not exactly in North Africa where Carthage is, but obviously, because they were such sea traders, obviously they moved around a bit. Carthage is located in North Africa, today in North Africa. Is it maybe near Libya, something like that, the country of Libya today? Libya, Libya. What the reason, and because these two are the dominant powers, and Carthage is known for its naval trade, they look at Rome as being a big-time threat. And thus, there are a series of Punic Wars, Punic, in which it is Carthage's desire to exterminate Rome from potentially being an empire. Unfortunately, for Carthage, this was not to be. Carthage had one of the most famous generals in world history, Hannibal, Hannibal. Obviously no relation to Hannibal Lecter, the cannibal, but Hannibal, who successfully navigated over the Alps mountains and defeated the Romans after coming down, which was a remarkable feat, which is still even talked about by military historians today. Unfortunately, Hannibal does end up losing, and one of the victorious and big heroes of Rome is a general by the name of Scipio, Scipio. And Rome does defeat Carthage. It does defeat them and thus takes control of Spain, which was a location of quite a bit of wealth and lots of goods being produced there that Carthage used to have dominance over, as well as the majority of the trade routes that Carthage previously have. So now Rome, after its defeat of Carthage, is the preeminent power in both the eastern and the western Mediterranean. Unfortunately, even though they are expanding, they're experiencing quite a bit of domestic problems. And their domestic problems are quite similar to the Han Dynasty when it gets into the idea of land redistribution. Land is overwhelmingly held by the patrician, the aristocratic class, and the plebeians don't like it very much. They want some redistribution. They want a more egalitarian society. There are certain people who are part of the patrician class. In fact, these two brothers, the Gracchi brothers, Gracchi, the Gracchi brothers, were equestrians. Meaning that that's how their family made money. I described what an equestrian was last class. Okay? The Gracchi brothers very much support land redistribution. Unfortunately, they were so adamant about their policies and they angered so many people that both of them, one by one, there was a few-year period in between, were both assassinated. And this is going to lead into a period of civil unrest and soon civil war, okay? Where you had two sides against each other, the patricians versus the plebeians, okay? On the side of the patricians, and their big general is a guy by the name of Sulla, S-U-L-L-A. On the side of the plebeians and the commoners was Gaius Marius, G-A-I-U-S, Marius, capital M-A-R-I-U-S. But one of the reasons why that the patricians won this war against the plebeians, even though there are a lot more patricians than plebeians, is how the patricians recruited for the army. They did something very wise, which was for a great deal of poor people who don't seem to have too much economic future or a great deal of potential to raise their stakes, these are the people who the patricians marketed to join the Roman army, right? Because if these low, reasonably people who are poor are part of the Roman army, they'll think to themselves, wow, Rome wants me to be their representative as they go and conquer all of these lands. Back then, as you may know, it was quite an honor to be part of an army and to be part of a legion, part of a troop of people that are responsible for taking something for the glory of Rome. And patricians actively marketed to bring these virile, tough, strong men into their army. And they ended up using this army to fight the plebeians, and the patricians ended up winning the civil war. Sulla became one of the consuls for a period of time. He was a bit tyrannical, not in a good way. Some time passes, a few decades, and now we're in the era of Caesar. Caesar was the Caesar family was a reasonably low-ranking family of the patricians. They weren't like anything spectacular or special, but Julius Caesar was amazingly motivated, and he was, I guess, a larger-than-life type of man who not only very ambitious and also made a great fortune for his family, but also obviously as a military general as well. He also had a very good reputation. He also knew how to cater to the public. And he was also known as a social reformer, and he was someone who was looked upon as being a threat to the patricians and to the Senate. By then, the tribunes had a bit lost their power. Caesar, after coming and conquering Gaul, G-A-U-L, Gaul being much of what makes up the country of France, comes back to Rome and sort of seizes it in 49 BCE, and then in 46 BCE, he takes the Senate and the consuls and he says, you know what, I am dictator for life. And you know what, this type of tyrannical behavior, as I mentioned in Greece, was not always frowned upon. All right, because of the fact that Caesar was so respected for being a social reformer, and thus the crowds cheered, etc., etc. But of course, the aristocracy, who was not to benefit from Caesar's policies, was not cheering. And thus, is it any shock that despite his social reforms and despite centralizing control, Caesar is assassinated in 44 BCE, assassinated by, you would say, the patrician class and one of its, one of its leaders. Well, Brutus, Marcus Brutus. You know, I'm sure you've all heard Et tu, Brute. Brutus was, well, I guess you could say, one of Caesar's sons that he never had, even though he did have a son, but did not live long enough to see it really properly grow up. He had a son by Cleopatra, among other people. Anyways, so now we're at a period now where nobody has firm control over Rome. And Rome is being fought over by a group of people. The first is Octavian, 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 or some people say Ian, it could be either one, just Octavian. Octavian was a member of the Caesar family, and maybe you've seen the HBO miniseries Rome. I greatly recommend that. That's good times, good times. Anyways, and that's not pure history, but certainly it enlivens it up a little bit. Anyways, Octavian, and who represents Caesar's forces, and then Octavian was against, you could say at first, Marcus Brutus. And Brutus was representing sort of the old patrician guard in Rome. And Octavian wins that battle. Later on, Octavian then gets into another series of civil wars against Mark Antony, Antony, who later in his life becomes, well, first, Mark Antony was actually married to Octavian's sister, and then he leaves Octavian's sister, even though she bore him several children, and went and was seduced by Miss Cleopatra of Egypt. And that's your Mark Antony and Cleopatra relationship. And then Cleopatra actually gave birth to a couple of Mark Antony's twins. So Cleopatra had children by both Caesar and Mark Antony. Anyways, Cleopatra, Octavian does a very keen thing and basically labels Cleopatra and Mark Antony as very decadent and living this unholy, impure life in Egypt. And Rome ends up taking over Egypt, and both Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide, the latter of which is a little bit controversial as to exactly how she died. Now, Octavian is the man. And soon, Octavian discards that name and takes on a new name, Augustus. Augustus, Augustus. Julius Caesar, July, Augustus, August. Beginning of this. 27 BCE, he is now the, you could say, dictator. But he doesn't like to think of it as a dictatorship. In fact, one of Augustus's greatest strengths was that he was able to promote Rome as a republic, whereas really it was more of a monarchy. And he was a king who had control of this great army, etc., etc. And this great new standing army he had under his control really maintained the idea of creating Rome no longer as a republic, but as an empire with a king. As an empire with a king. And it's during this time of Augustus and some of the rulers that come right after Augustus where the empire continues to expand. All right, we're expanding not only into the Mediterranean basin, but also into Western Europe. For instance, those English people who are listening to this know about Hadrian's Wall in England, Hadrian, and all the battles that went on in England with the Roman Empire and the natives, the Celts there. They just made a movie about it called Centurion about a year ago. It's okay. Anyways. While it's expanding, this is also the era of the Pax Romana. The army is out trying to make more land part of the Roman Empire, but by that same token, it's also a period of peace, Roman peace. And this lasts for 2.5 centuries, okay? So from the end of that millennium up through, a couple hundred years later, all right? During this time, Roman roads, they're paved very well. You've got a keen postal system. Also, laws. Laws were written a long time ago in Rome. Something called the 12 Tables. And these 12 Tables still have, still had a certain legitimacy within Rome. I think these 12 Tables were done in somewhere around 450 BCE was when they were originally erected. Excuse me. All right. So that takes us through the, you could say, First two-thirds are what we're going to be talking about politically in terms of Rome. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the economy and society within the Roman Mediterranean. Okay? Now, the Roman Mediterranean, yes. The Mediterranean is basically a Roman lake. Take a look at a map, see how large the Mediterranean is and the variety of areas it goes to, and you can only imagine the amount of money and funds that have been taken in by Roman traders, etc., etc. Huge amount. That's one way in which Rome made a lot of money. Another way Rome made a lot of money was obviously through agriculture and its great plantations. Roman plantations are called latifundia. Latifundia, latifundia. And these are the great plantations. Great plantations. Let's talk now about, yes, let's now talk about the city of Rome itself. The city of Rome is a splendid splendor of lavish wealth being everywhere, okay? You got statues, you got pools, you got fountains, you got arches, you got tubs, temples, you got stadiums. Rome was the first place where concrete was used. You ever get a question about concrete? Concrete was first used in Rome as a construction material. There are tons of immigrants obviously wanting to come to Rome because it's this great city in which you can make your fortune, and it's just where the excitement is, right? I mean, there are pools and gymnasiums and circuses and stadiums for gladiator shows. I mean, this is all about Rome. Rome is the exciting place to be, okay? But Rome also came up with a lot of good practical ideas as well. Something that made Rome and other cities of the Roman Empire successful was that they were able to create technology that assisted for a good deal of irrigation and just the proper utilage of water. One of the ways they did this is through a system of aqueducts. Where these aqueducts, A-Q-U-E-D-U-C-T-S, they would carry a steady supply of water to towns from the spring or from the source in the hills, and they would sort of make their way down in these aqueducts, and Rome was very successful at building those particular things. Family and society within Roman times. Okay, first of all, as you may imagine, Rome is also a patriarchy. In fact, they had their own term for it. It's called paterfamilias, which basically means the eldest male of the family ruled, the eldest family. This is what typically happens in Italian families, not with Fredo Corleone of The Godfather, but paterfamilias, okay? However, with that being known, women would exert their influence over their family. They would do stuff in a very supervisory kind of way. So women would exert their influence. They would do so, and they would supervise. Another way that society was ruled was through a system of clientage. All right, clientage is like this idea, it's a system of mutual dependency, all right, in which powerful rulers protect lower people in exchange for an economic or political deal in which they'll be allowed to rule over, blah, blah, blah. Protection for political or economic advantages. And that system of clientage is also very popular in the Roman Empire. Rome itself, as I mentioned before, the rich knew how to live it up. Very lavish, very spoiled, very greedy. And they would, they just threw the most ostentatious, tacky and wasteful parties, whereas the majority of Romans, and I'm talking by far the majority of Romans, lived in subsistence level. And when I mean subsistence level, S-U-B-S-I-S-T-E-N-C-E. This means basically they make enough to survive, but they're not really saving anything and they can't provide for any type of luxury. So can you imagine that class divide where you've got a very small minority of extremely rich and the majority of people are just barely getting by? That's not cool. That's not cool. And that's why poor classes are going to become a problem in Rome and in other places within the empire as time goes on. In fact, Rome, one of its great failings was never coming up with any type of social welfare system in order to assist people who don't have as much. Maybe that would have led to a little bit less debauchery and a little bit more, Rome wouldn't have fallen apart so spectacularly. Okay, it's very similar, almost like to Marie Antoinette, let them eat their bread. Here, the idea with the Roman rich saying, well, they have their bread in their circuses, big entertainment. But again, Rome could have done much better with that. And with that in mind, always keep in mind that it's not just the average person who's barely getting by. A third of the population are slaves. Can you imagine that? Like, imagine your school or whatever it is, and a third of those people must serve you, or you must serve. Right? 33%. That's ridiculous. And there are some very famous slave revolts throughout Roman history. They don't ultimately succeed, but they stand the test of time. Maybe the most famous of which is Spartacus. It was made into a movie, Spartacus. In fact, I think it was made into a TV series on Starz. I haven't seen it yet. The American cable channel, not too long ago. And Spartacus's uprising was in 73 BCE, but unfortunately it didn't do well. However, slaves could be freed. They weren't necessarily imprisoned for life. Okay? There were times when masters would free their slaves, typically around the age of 30 or 35. And this was called manumission, M-A-N-U-M-I-S-S-I-O-N. And it's the idea of slaves being freed after they serve their time or they've done enough work where their masters feel like they've earned their freedom. Okay? That talks about economy and society. Let's now move on to the Cosmopolitan Mediterranean. The Cosmopolitan Mediterranean. And what is this about? It's about continuing the influence of Greece. Okay, as I mentioned before in I think it was last class, I talked about the influence that the Hellenistic philosophies had on Greece. Like people, great statesmen like Cicero. Cicero was a great political statesman during the time of Caesar and Octavian. Well, actually, yeah, Caesar really. He was assassinated, I think, sometime shortly after Caesar died. I'm trying to think what the circumstances were, but it's obviously not important for this class. But as I mentioned before, again, Rome really followed the Greek way when it came to philosophy and when it came to culture. Of course, Zeus became Jupiter, Apollo became Mercury, is it? And I'm not very good at this. I know that Aphrodite became Venus, right? Right? Stuff like that. Okay. Anyways, Stoicism, very influential, Cicero, etc. What also is going on in Roman society is similar to Greek, is the idea of religions of salvation and these mystery religions. Okay, those also become big. What is a mystery religion? A mystery religion is the idea of trying to speculate exactly why it is that we're here, and it proposes a certain amount of it's very strange because a lot of these mystery religions have ethics in them which are very similar to Christianity. And they also propose certain ideas that, like, for instance, maybe there is one single God, and maybe this God is going to take the form of a man, and perhaps this man is going to appear on earth and then is going to die as a martyr. So this was already in mystery religions before Jesus of Nazareth was born. I mean, this is amazing, but this shows Jesus almost sort of, just slightly comes after the popularity of a great deal of these mystery religions. So almost that that Christ was bound to happen, or at least chronologically was due to occur. It's kind of strange. Some names of these mystery religions or religions of salvation: cult of Isis, I-S-I-S, a very popular one. And another religion of salvation that was popular among the Roman army was called Mithraism. M-I-T-H-R-A-I-S-M, Mithraism. Mithraism is all about worshiping the Persian sun god. And Roman men loved it because they would have to march all the time and they would hope that it would always be sunny. So they were worshiping the sun because the sun is what provides life and provides growth, etc., etc. It provides heat and warmth, stuff like that. But now, as you can tell, we're going to be heading to... Well, we're not going to tell the full story of Jesus, of course. This is not a Christian class. This is a history class. We do BCE and CE. But let's now talk about where Jews are at this time, and then let's get into early Christianity. All right, so we talked about Judaism before in a previous chapter about Moses and the Torah and the 5 books, okay? Now, Jews, there are plenty of Jews living within the Roman Empire. However, Jews are sometimes not exactly beloved. Why? Because Jews believe in one God. They're monotheists. They're Yahweh. But at the same time, the Roman Empire requires the Roman citizens to look at the emperor as a god as well. This isn't going to work with Jews. And so thus, Jews consider the state cult of the Roman Empire to be blasphemous. And this is going to lead to obviously a good deal of conflict between Roman authorities and Jews. It really depended on the emperor to determine how the Jews would get along during his lifetime. Different emperors had different policies towards Jews. There's obviously a good deal of mysticism within Judaism. One of them is the sect of Judaism that created something called the Essenes. E-S-S E-N-E-S. And these Essenes, or these mystical ideas, are written on what are now called the Dead Sea Scrolls, scrolls found inside the Dead Sea. Okay, anyways, Jesus of Nazareth, that's where he's born, Nazareth, N-A-Z-A-R-E-T-H. Of course, he's a charismatic Jewish teacher. He taught devotion of God. and to love human beings and to be modest about yourself. He attracted incredibly large crowds through his wisdom, through its oratorical skills, and through, as religious books would have it, through his miraculous powers. He often would use the word that the kingdom of God is at hand. And this didn't go down too well with Roman authorities because according to the state cult, well, the emperor is basically God. So how could the kingdom of God be at hand when it's, according to the Roman authorities, it's already here? And this is going to lead to friction again between this charismatic Jewish speaker and the Roman authorities. He was crucified in the early 30s of the Common Era, and thus afterwards his followers appointed him Christ. And Christ means the appointed one. The appointed one. What happens is there are a variety of, you could say, literatures written after the life of Christ that later on become part of the New Testament. And the New Testament is the book added to the Old Testament, which makes up the Christian Bible. Some of these books, since I'm mentioning right now that were created, some of these things, the first, we should say, are the epistles. And the epistles, E-P-I-S-T-L-E-S, are letters to and from churches with specific questions. So like these new churches within the Christian religion over the first couple hundred years have questions about what they should do, what the, all sorts of routines should be, processes, rituals, all this stuff. These questions were, for example, were sent to, you could say, Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus, of course, became Paul of Tarsus, right? St. Paul. And so he along with other people began to answer these questions in order to properly spread the religion. As you may imagine, there is lots of different types of Christianity that is being sent out there. But Paul of Tarsus, he was Saul, now he's Paul, Saul S-A-U-L, Paul obviously P-A-U-L. He becomes the first major missionary for the spread of Christianity. Paul emphasized faith over the minute observance of law. And remember that. Paul recognizes faith over just following every exact law that there is. Okay? And the other book I wanted to mention, or other four books actually, are the Gospels. The Gospels were written in between 70 CE and 100 CE. I think 70 was Mark and 100 was John, something like that. Okay? And obviously the Gospels deal with Jesus' life, Jesus' message, his missions, and again, they provide for a fascinating read, but there are certain key differences within those Gospels. But again, if you want to study religion, they do make for an interesting read. Christianity itself, it grows very fast. Not as fast as Islam. Islam is probably the fastest growing religion like ever. But Christianity does grow very fast. Who does Christianity appeal to? It appeals to a group that's very different than that of Islam, and different of that of certain elements of Buddhism. So here's the thing. Christianity appeals to women, to lower classes, and to the urban population. All right? Women, lower classes, and urban population. Why? Because Jesus is giving them some type of salvation. And who needs a salvation? Well, the people who are in the lower dregs of society, not those who are on the very top of it. Okay? Christianity is going to spread, and it's going to become the dominant faith in the Mediterranean by the 3rd century of the Common Era. And this brings us to the end of chapter 11. Hooray! We ended a chapter in the class. That's fantastic. Okay? Next chapter, chapter 12, are the Silk Roads, and we're going to talk about that next time, as well as the downfall of the Roman Empire. In addition, we're probably going to end up starting Byzantium, chapter 13, which now we're into the post-classical era. Chapter 13, the beginning of the post-classical era, from 500 CE onwards is sort of the abbreviated time that is offered or given. Okay? But for now, I want to give you a couple questions that you can think about before you start the next class. And these questions are following. Number one, what were the significance of the Punic Wars to the Roman Empire? Number two, what was the appeal of early Christian teachings? And number three, how did the Republican Constitution set the stage for conflict between the patricians and the plebeians? Again, the significance of the Punic Wars to the Roman Empire. What was the appeal of early Christian teachings? And also, how did the Republican Constitution set the stage for conflict between patricians and plebeians? Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next class about the downfall of the Roman Empire and the Silk Roads. Bye-bye.